Recording by Lynn Prachar. Charles Dickens' 200th Anniversary Collection, Volume 2. A Child's Dream of by Charles Dickens. There once was a child, and he strolled about a number of people. He had a sister who was a child too, and his constant companion. These two used to wander all day long. Flowers. They wondered at the height and peaks of the sky. They wondered at the depth of the bright blue. They wondered at the goodness and power of God. They used to say to one another sometimes, all the children of the earth will die. There's no water in the sky. They believed they would be sorry, for, said they, the buds are the children of the flowers, and the little playful streams that gambol down to the ground are the children of the earth, and the smallest bright specks playing at hide and seek in the sky all night must surely be the children of the stars, and they would all be grieved to see their playmates, the children of men. There was one clear shining star that used to come out in the sky behind the ground, near the church spire above the grave. It was larger and more than the others. Every night they watched for it, standing at the window. Whoever saw it cried out, and often they cried out both together, knowing so well when it would rise and when. So they grew to be such friends with it that when they were lying down in their bed, they always looked out once again to bid it good night. And when the angels were around together, they used to say, God bless my brother. But when she was still very young, very, very young, the sister drooped, grew to be so weak that she could no longer sleep at night. And then the child looked sadly out by himself, and when he saw the star, turned round and said to the patient, pale face on the bed, and then a smile came over his face, and he used to say, God bless my brother and the star. And so the time came all too soon, when the child looked out alone, and when there was no face on the bed, and when there was a little grave among the graves, and when the star fell rays down from heaven. Now these rays were so bright, and they seemed to make such a shining way from earth to heaven, that when the child lay in his solitary bed, he dreamed about the star, and dreamed that lying where he was, he saw a train of people taken up that sparkling light, and the star, opening, showed him a room where 4,000 angels waited to receive him. All these angels who were waiting turned their backs behind them and carried up into the star. Some came out from the long rows in which they stood, and fell upon the people's necks and kissed them tenderly, and went away with them in avenues of light, and were so happy in their company that lying in his bed he wept for joy. But there were many angels who did not go with them, and among them one he knew. The patient face that once had lain upon the bed was glorified and radiant, but his heart found out his sister among all the host. His sister's angel lingered near the entrance of the star, and said to the leader among those who had brought the people thither, Is my brother come? And he said, No. She was turning hopefully away, when the child stretched out his arms and cried, Oh, sister, I am here, take me. And then she turned her beaming eyes upon him, and it was night, and the star was shining into the room, making long rays down towards him as he saw it through his tears. From that hour forth, the child looked out upon the star as on the home he was to go, when his time should come, and he thought that he did not belong to the earth alone, but to the star too, because of his sister's angel gone before. There was a baby born to be brother to the child, and while he was so little that he never yet had spoken word, he stretched his tiny form out on his bed and died. Again the child dreamed of the open star, and of the company of angels, and the train of people, and the rows of angels with their beaming eyes all turned upon those people's faces. Said his sister's angel to the leader, "Is my brother come?" And he said, "Not that one, but another." As the child beheld his brother's angel in her arms, he cried, "Oh, sister, I am here, take me." And she turned and smiled upon him, and the star was shining. He grew to be a young man, and was busy at his books, when an old servant came to him and said, "Thy mother is no more. I bring her blessing on her darling son." Again at night he saw the star, and all that former company. Said his sister's angel to the leader, "Is my brother come?" And he said, "Thy mother." A mighty cry of joy went forth through all the star, because the mother was reunited to her two children. And he stretched out his arms and cried, "Oh, mother, sister, and brother, I am here, take me." And they answered him, "Not yet." And the star was shining. He grew to be a man whose hair was turning gray, and he was sitting in his chair by the fireside, heavy with grief, and with his face bedewed with tears, when the star opened once again. Said his sister's angel to the leader, "Is my brother come?" And he said, "Nay, but his maiden daughter." And the man who had been the child saw his daughter newly lost to him, a celestial creature among those three, and he said, "My daughter's head is on my sister's bosom, and her arm is around my mother's neck, and at her feet there is the baby of old time, and I can bear the parting from her, God be praised." And the star was shining. Thus the child came to be an old man, and his once smooth face was wrinkled, and his steps were slow and feeble, and his back was bent. And one night, as he lay upon his bed, his children standing round, he cried, as he had cried so long ago, "I see the star." They whispered one another, "He is dying." And he said, "I am. My age is falling from me like a garment, and I move towards the star as a child. And oh, my Father, now I thank thee that it has so often opened to receive those dear ones who await me." And the star was shining, and it shines upon his grave. End of A Child's Dream of a Star, from reprinted pieces. Recording by Lynn Prachar, Morrow, Illinois.
Lying Awake. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason Mills. Charles Dickens' 200th Anniversary Collection, Volume 2. Lying Awake, by Charles Dickens. My uncle lay with his eyes half closed, and his nightcap drawn almost down to his nose. His fancy was already wandering, and began to mingle up the present scene with the crater of Vesuvius, the French Opera, the Colosseum at Rome, Dolly's Chop House in London, and all the farrago of noted places with which the brain of a traveller is crammed. In a word, he was just falling asleep. Thus that delightful writer, Washington Irving, in his Tales of a Traveller. But it happened to me the other night to be lying, not with my eyes half closed, but with my eyes wide open, not with my nightcap drawn almost down to my nose, for on sanitary principles I never wear a nightcap, but with my hair pitchforked and tousled all over the pillow, not just falling asleep by any means, but glaringly, persistently, and obstinately broad awake. Perhaps, with no scientific intention or invention, I was illustrating the theory of the duality of the brain. Perhaps one part of my brain, being wakeful, sat up to watch the other part, which was sleepy. Be that as it may, something in me was as desirous to go to sleep as it possibly could be, but something else in me would not go to sleep, and was as obstinate as George the Third. Thinking of George the Third, for I devote this paper to my train of thoughts as I lay awake, most people lying awake sometimes, and having some interest in the subject, put me in mind of Benjamin Franklin, and so Benjamin Franklin's paper on the art of procuring pleasant dreams, which would seem necessarily to include the art of going to sleep, came into my head. Now, as I often used to read that paper when I was a very small boy, and as I recollect everything I read then as perfectly as I forget everything I read now, I quoted, "Get out of bed, beat up and turn your pillow, shake the bedclothes well with at least 20 shakes, then throw the bed open and leave it to cool. In the meanwhile, continuing undressed, walk about your chamber. When you begin to feel the cold air unpleasant, then return to your bed, and you will soon fall asleep, and your sleep will be sweet and pleasant." Not a bit of it. I performed the whole ceremony, and if it were possible for me to be more saucer-eyed than I was before, that was the only result that came of it. Except Niagara. The two quotations from Washington Irving and Benjamin Franklin may have put it in my head by an American association of ideas, but there I was, and the horseshoe fall was thundering and tumbling in my eyes and ears, and the very rainbows that I left upon the spray when I really did last look upon it were beautiful to see. The night light being quite as plain, however, and sleep seeming to be many thousand miles further off than Niagara, I made up my mind to think a little about sleep, which I no sooner did than I whirled off in spite of myself to Drury Lane Theatre, and there saw a great actor and dear friend of mine, whom I had been thinking of in the day, playing Macbeth, and heard him apostrophising the death of each day's life, as I have heard him many a time in the days that are gone. But sleep. I will think about sleep. I am determined to think, this is the way I went on, about sleep. I must hold the word sleep tight and fast, or I shall be off at a tangent in half a second. I feel myself unaccountably straying already into Clare Market. Sleep! It would be curious, as illustrating the equality of sleep, to inquire how many of its phenomena are common to all classes, to all degrees of wealth and poverty, to every grade of education and ignorance. Here, for example, is Her Majesty Queen Victoria in her palace, this present blessed night, and here is Winking Charlie, a sturdy vagrant, in one of Her Majesty's jails. Her Majesty has fallen many thousands of times from that same tower which I claim a right to tumble off now and then. So has Winking Charlie. Her Majesty in her sleep has opened or prorogued Parliament, or has held a drawing-room, attired in some very scanty dress, the deficiencies and improprieties of which have caused her great uneasiness. I, in my degree, have suffered unspeakable agitation of mind from taking the chair at a public dinner at the London Tavern in my night-clothes, which not all the courtesy of my kind friend and host Mr. Bathe could persuade me were quite adapted to the occasion. Winking Charlie has been repeatedly tried in a worse condition. Her Majesty is no stranger to a vault or firmament of a sort of floor-cloth, with an indistinct pattern distantly resembling eyes, which occasionally obtrudes itself on her repose. Neither am I. Neither is Winking Charlie. It is quite common to all three of us to skim along with airy strides a little above the ground, also to hold, with the deepest interest, dialogues with various people, all represented by ourselves, and to be at our wits' end to know what they are going to tell us, and to be indescribably astonished by the secrets they disclose. It is probable that we have all three committed murders and hidden bodies. It is pretty certain that we have all desperately wanted to cry out and have had no voice, that we have all gone to the play and not been able to get in, that we have all dreamed much more of our youth than of our later lives, that... I have lost it. The thread's broken. And up I go. I, lying here with the night-light before me, up I go, for no reason on earth that I can find out, and drawn by no links that are visible to me, up the great St. Bernard. I have lived in Switzerland, and rambled among the mountains, but why I should go there now, and why up the great St. Bernard in preference to any other mountain, I have no idea. As I lie here, broad awake, and with every sense so sharpened that I can distinctly hear distant noises inaudible to me at another time, I make that journey, as I really did, on the same summer day, with the same happy party. Ah, 2 since dead, I grieve to think. And there is the same track, with the same black wooden arms to point the way, and there are the same storm refuges here and there, and there is the same snow falling at the top, and there are the same frosty mists, and there is the same intensely cold convent with its menagerie smell, and the same breed of dogs fast dying out, and the same breed of jolly young monks, whom I mourn to know as humbugs, and the same convent parlour with its piano, and the sitting round the fire, and the same supper, and the same lone night in a cell, and the same bright fresh morning, when going out into the highly rarefied air was like a plunge into an icy bath. Now, see here what comes along, and why does this thing stalk into my mind on the top of a Swiss mountain? It is a figure that I once saw, just after dark, chalked upon a door in a little back lane near a country church, my first church. How young a child I may have been at the time I don't know, but it horrified me so intensely, in connection with the churchyard, I suppose, for it smokes a pipe, and has a big hat with each of its ears sticking out in a horizontal line under the brim, and is not in itself more oppressive than a mouth from ear to ear, a pair of goggle eyes, and hands like 2 bunches of carrots, 5 in each, can make it, that it is still vaguely alarming to me to recall, as I have often done before, lying awake, the running home, the looking behind, the horror of its following me. Though whether disconnected from the door, or door and all, I can't say, and perhaps never could. It lays a disagreeable train. I must resolve to think of something on the voluntary principle. The balloon ascents of this last season. They will do to think about while I lie awake, as well as anything else. I must hold them tight, though, for I feel them sliding away, and in their stead are the Mannings, husband and wife, hanging on the top of Horsemonger Lane Jail, in connection with which dismal spectacle I recall this curious fantasy of the mind, that, having beheld that execution, and having left those 2 forms dangling on the top of the entrance gateway, the man's a limp loose suit of clothes, as if the man had gone out of them, the woman's a fine shape, so elaborately corseted and artfully dressed that it was quite unchanged in its trim appearance as it slowly swung from side to side. I never could, by my uttermost efforts, for some weeks, present the outside of that prison to myself, which the terrible impression I had received continually obliged me to do, without presenting it with the 2 figures still hanging in the morning air, until, strolling past the gloomy place one night, when the street was deserted and quiet, and actually seeing that the bodies were not there, my fancy was persuaded, as it were, to take them down, and bury them within the precincts of the jail, where they have lain ever since. The balloon ascents of last season. Let me reckon them up. There were the horse, the bull, the parachute, and the tumbler hanging on, chiefly by his toes, I believe, below the car. Very wrong, indeed, and decidedly to be stopped. But, in connection with these and similar dangerous exhibitions, it strikes me that that portion of the public whom they entertain is unjustly reproached. Their pleasure is in the difficulty overcome. They are a public of great faith, and are quite confident that the gentleman will not fall off the horse, or the lady off the bull, or out of the parachute, and that the tumbler has a firm hold with his toes. They do not go to see the adventurer vanquished, but triumphant. There is no parallel in public combats between men and beasts, because nobody can answer for the particular beast, unless it were always the same beast, in which case it would be a mere stage show, which the same public would go in the same state of mind to see, entirely believing in the brute being beforehand safely subdued by the man. That they are not accustomed to calculate hazards and dangers with any nicety, we may know from their rash exposure of themselves in overcrowded steamboats, and unsafe conveyances, and places of all kinds. And I cannot help thinking that instead of railing and attributing savage motives to a people naturally well disposed and humane, it is better to teach them, and lead them argumentatively and reasonably, for they are very reasonable, if you will discuss a matter with them, to more considerate and wise conclusions. This is a disagreeable intrusion. Here is a man with his throat cut, dashing towards me as I lie awake. A recollection of an old story of a kinsman of mine, who, going home one foggy night to Hampstead, when London was much smaller, and the road lonesome, suddenly encountered such a figure rushing past him, and presently 2 keepers from a madhouse in pursuit. A very unpleasant creature indeed to come into my mind unbidden, as I lie awake. The balloon ascents of last season. I must return to the balloons. Why did the bleeding man start out of them? Never mind. If I inquire, he will be back again. The balloons. This particular public have inherently a great pleasure in the contemplation of physical difficulties overcome, mainly, as I take it, because the lives of a large majority of them are exceedingly monotonous and real, and further, are a struggle against continual difficulties, and further still, because anything in the form of accidental injury, or any kind of illness or disability, is so very serious in their own sphere. I will explain this seeming paradox of mine. Take the case of a Christmas pantomime. Surely nobody supposes that the young mother in the pit, who falls into fits of laughter when the baby is boiled or sat upon, would be at all diverted by such an occurrence off the stage. Nor is the decent workman in the gallery, who is transported beyond the ignorant present by the delight with which he sees a stout gentleman pushed out of a 2 pair of stairs window, to be slandered by the suspicion that he will be in the least entertained by such a spectacle in any street in London, Paris, or New York. It always appears to me that the secret of this enjoyment lies in the temporary superiority to the common hazards and mischances of life, in seeing casualties attended when they really occur with bodily and mental suffering, tears, and poverty, happen through a very rough sort of poetry, without the least harm being done to anyone, the pretence of distress in a pantomime being so broadly humorous as to be no pretence at all. Much as in the comic fiction I can understand the mother with a very vulnerable baby at home, greatly relishing the invulnerable baby on the stage, so in the Cremorne reality I can understand the mason, who is always liable to fall off a scaffold in his working jacket and to be carried to the hospital, having an infinite admiration of the radiant personage in spangles who goes into the clouds upon a bull, or upside down, and who, he takes it for granted, not reflecting upon the thing, has, by uncommon skill and dexterity, conquered such mischances as those to which he and his acquaintance are continually exposed. I wish the morgue in Paris would not come here as I lie awake, with its ghastly beds, and the swollen saturated clothes hanging up, and the water dripping, dripping all day long, upon that other swollen saturated something in the corner, like a heap of crushed over-ripe figs that I have seen in Italy. And this detestable morgue comes back again at the head of a procession of forgotten ghost stories. This will never do. I must think of something else as I lie awake, or, like that sagacious animal in the United States, who recognized the colonel who was such a dead shot, I am a gone coon. What shall I think of? The late brutal assaults. Very good subject. The late brutal assaults. Though whether, supposing I should see, here before me as I lie awake, the awful phantom described in one of those ghost stories, who, with a headdress of shroud, was always seen looking in through a certain glass door at a certain dead hour, whether in such a case it would be the least consolation to me to know on philosophical grounds that it was merely my imagination, is a question I can't help asking myself by the way. The late brutal assaults. I strongly question the expediency of advocating the revival of whipping for those crimes. It is a natural and generous impulse to be indignant at the perpetration of inconceivable brutality, but I doubt the whipping panacea gravely. Not in the least regard or pity for the criminal, whom I hold in far lower estimation than a mad wolf, but in consideration for the general tone and feeling, which is very much improved since the whipping times. It is bad for a people to be familiarized with such punishments. When the whip went out of Bridewell, and ceased to be flourished at the cart's tail and at the whipping post, it began to fade out of madhouses, and workhouses, and schools and families, and to give place to a better system everywhere than cruel driving. It would be hasty, because a few brutes may be inadequately punished, to revive in any aspect what, in so many aspects, society is hardly yet happily rid of. The whip is a very contagious kind of thing, and difficult to confine within one set of bounds. Utterly abolish punishment by fine, a barbarous device, quite as much out of date as wager by battle, but particularly connected in the vulgar mind with this class of offence. At least quadruple the term of imprisonment for aggravated assaults, and above all let us, in such cases, have no pet prisoning, vain glorifying, strong soup and roasted meats, but hard work, and one unchanging and uncompromising dietary of bread and water, well or ill, and we shall do much better than by going down into the dark to grope for the whip among the rusty fragments of the rack and the branding iron, and the chains and gibbet from the public roads, and the weights that pressed men to death in the cells of Newgate. I had proceeded thus far, when I found I had been lying awake so long that the very dead began to wake too, and to crowd into my thoughts most sorrowfully. Therefore I resolved to lie awake no more, but to get up and go out for a night walk, which resolution was an acceptable relief to me, as I dare say it may prove now to a great many more. End of Lying Awake. Recording by Jason Mills.
Section 17. Charles Dickens' 200th Anniversary Collection, Volume 2, by Charles Dickens. Our School, from reprinted pieces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joyce Martin. Charles Dickens' 200th Anniversary Collection, Volume 2, Section 17, by Charles Dickens. Our School. We went to look at it only this last midsummer, and found that the railway had cut it up root and branch. A great trunk line had swallowed the playground, sliced away the schoolroom, and pared off the corner of the house which, thus curtailed of its proportions, presented itself in a green stage of stucco profile-wise toward the road, like a forlorn flatiron without a handle, standing on end. It seems as if our schools were doomed to be the sport of change. We have faint recollections of a preparatory day school which we have sought in vain, and which must have been pulled down to make a new street ages ago. We have dim impressions, scarcely amounting to a belief, that it was over a dyer's shop. We know that you went up steps to it, that you frequently grazed your knees in doing so, that you generally got your leg over the scraper in trying to scrape the mud off a very unsteady little shoe. The mistress of the establishment holds no place in our memory, but, rampant on one eternal doormat, in an eternal entry long and narrow, is a puffy pug dog with a personal animosity toward us, who triumphs over time. The bark of that baleful pug, a certain radiating way he had of snapping at our undefended legs, the ghastly grinning of his moist black muzzle and white teeth, and the insolence of his crisp tail curled like a pastoral crook, all live and flourish. From an otherwise unaccountable association of him with a fiddle, we conclude that he was of French extraction, and his name Fidele. He belonged to some female, chiefly inhabiting a back parlor, whose life appears to us to have been consumed in sniffing, and in wearing a brown beaver bonnet. For her he would sit up and balance cake upon his nose, and not eat it until 20 had been counted. To the best of our belief we were once called in to witness this performance, when, unable even in his milder moments to endure our presence, he instantly made at us, cake and all. Why a something in mourning called Miss Frost should still connect itself with our preparatory school we are unable to say. We retain no impression of the beauty of Miss Frost, if she were beautiful, or of the mental fascinations of Miss Frost, if she were accomplished. Yet her name and her black dress hold an enduring place in our remembrance. An equally impersonal boy, whose name has long since shaped itself unalterably into Mr. Maules, is not to be dislodged from our brain. Retaining no vindictive feelings toward Maules, no feeling whatever indeed, we infer that neither he nor we can have loved Miss Frost. Our first impression of death and burial is associated with this formless pair. We all three nestled awfully in a corner one wintry day, when the wind was blowing shrill with Miss Frost's pinafore over our heads, and Miss Frost told us in a whisper about somebody being screwed down. It is the only distinct recollection we preserve of those impalpable creatures, except a suspicion that the manners of Master Maules were susceptible of much improvement. Generally speaking, we may observe that whenever we see a child intently occupied with its nose, to the exclusion of all other subjects of interest, our mind reverts in a flash to Master Maules. But the school that was our school before the railroad came and overthrew it was quite another sort of place. We were old enough to be put into Virgil when we went there, and to get prizes for a variety of polishing on which the rust had long accumulated. It was a school of some celebrity in its neighborhood, nobody could have said why, and we had the honor to attain and hold the eminent position of first boy. The master was supposed among us to know nothing, and one of the ushers was supposed to know everything. We are still inclined to think the first named supposition perfectly correct. We have a general idea that its subject had been in the leather trade, and had bought us, meaning our school, of another proprietor who was immensely learned. Whether this belief had any real foundation we are not likely ever to know now. The only branches of education with which he showed the least acquaintance were ruling and corporally punishing. He was always ruling ciphering books with a bloated mahogany ruler, or smiting the palms of offenders with the same diabolical instrument, or viciously drawing a pair of pantaloons tight with one of his large hands, and caning the wearer with the other. We have no doubt whatever that this occupation was the principal solace of his existence. A profound respect for money pervaded our school, which was of course derived from its chief. We remember an idiotic, goggle-eyed boy with a big head and half-crowns without end, who suddenly appeared as a parlor boarder, and was rumored to have come by sea from some mysterious part of the earth, where his parents rolled in gold. He was usually called Mr. by the chief, and was said to feed in the parlor on steaks and gravy, likewise to drink currant wine, and he openly stated that if rolls and coffee were ever denied him at breakfast, he would write home to that unknown part of the globe from which he had come, and cause himself to be recalled to the regions of gold. He was put into no form or class, but learnt alone, as little as he liked, and he liked very little. And there was a belief among us that this was because he was too wealthy to be taken down. His special treatment, and our vague association of him with the sea, and with storms and sharks and coral reefs, occasioned the wildest legends to be circulated as his history. A tragedy in blank verse was written on the subject, if our memory does not deceive us, by the hand that now chronicles these recollections, in which his father figured as a pirate, and was shot for a voluminous catalogue of atrocities, first imparting to his wife the secret of the cave in which his wealth was stored, and from which his only son's half-crowns now issued. Dumbledon, the boy's name, was represented as yet unborn when his brave father met his fate, and the despair and grief of Mrs. Dumbledon at that calamity was movingly shadowed forth as having weakened the parlor boarder's mind. This production was received with great favor, and was twice performed with closed doors in the dining-room, but it got wind and was seized as libellous, and brought the unlucky poet into severe affliction. Some 2 years afterwards, all of a sudden one day, Dumbledon vanished. It was whispered that the chief himself had taken him down to the docks and reshipped him for the Spanish Main, but nothing certain was ever known about his disappearance. At this hour we cannot thoroughly disconnect him from California. Our school was rather famous for mysterious pupils. There was another, a heavy young man, with a large double-cased silver watch and a fat knife, the handle of which was a perfect tool-box, who unaccountably appeared one day at a special desk of his own, erected close to that of the chief, with whom he held familiar converse. He lived in the parlor and went out for his walks, and never took the least notice of us, even of us, the first boy, unless to give us a deprecatory kick, or grimly to take our hat off and throw it away when he encountered us out of doors, which unpleasant ceremony he always performed as he passed, not even condescending to stop for the purpose. Some of us believed that the classical attainments of this phenomenon were terrific, but that his penmanship and arithmetic were defective, and he had come there to mend them. Others, that he was going to set up a school, and had paid the chief £25 down for leave to see our school at work. The gloomier spirits even said that he was going to buy us, against which contingency conspiracies were set on foot for a general defection and running away. However, he never did that. After staying for a quarter, during which period, though closely observed, he was never seen to do anything but make pens out of quills, write small-hand in a secret portfolio, and punch the point of the sharpest blade in his knife into his desk all over it. He too disappeared, and his place knew him no more. There was another boy, a fair, meek boy with a delicate complexion and rich curling hair, who, we found out, or thought we found out, we have no idea now, and probably had none then, on what grounds, but it was confidently revealed from mouth to mouth, was the son of a viscount who had deserted his lovely mother. It was understood that if he had his rights, he would be worth 20,000 a year, and that if his mother ever met his father she would shoot him with a silver pistol, which she carried, always loaded to the muzzle, for that purpose. He was a very suggestive topic. So was a young mulatto, who was always believed, though very amiable, to have a dagger about him somewhere. But we think they were both outshone, upon the whole, by another boy who claimed to have been born on the 29th of February, and to have only one birthday in 5 years. We suspect this to have been a fiction, but he lived upon it all the time he was at our school. The principal currency of our school was slate pencil. It had some inexplainable value that was never ascertained nor reduced to a standard. To have a great hoard of it was somehow to be rich. We used to bestow it in charity, and confer it as a precious boon upon our chosen friends. When the holidays were coming, contributions were solicited for certain boys whose relatives were in India, and who were appealed for under the generic name of holiday stoppers, appropriate marks of remembrance that should enliven and cheer them in their homeless state. Personally, we always contributed these tokens of sympathy in the form of a slate pencil, and always felt that it would be a comfort and a treasure to them. Our school was remarkable for white mice. Redpoles, linnets, and even canaries were kept in desks, drawers, hat boxes, and other strange refuges for birds, but white mice were the favorite stock. The boys trained the mice much better than the masters trained the boys. We recall one white mouse who lived in the cover of a Latin dictionary, who ran up ladders, drew Roman chariots, shouldered muskets, turned wheels, and even made a very creditable appearance on the stage as the dog of Montargis. He might have achieved greater things, but for having the misfortune to mistake his way in a triumphal procession to the Capitol, when he fell into a deep inkstand and was dyed black and drowned. The mice were the occasion of some most ingenious engineering in the construction of their houses and instruments of performance. The famous one belonged to a company of proprietors, some of whom have since made railroads, engines, and telegraphs. The chairman has erected mills and bridges in New Zealand. The usher at our school, who was considered to know everything, as opposed to the chief, who was considered to know nothing, was a bony, gentle-faced, clerical-looking young man in rusty black. It was whispered that he was sweet upon one of Maxby's sisters. Maxby lived close by and was a day pupil, and further that he favored Maxby. As we remember, he taught Italian to Maxby's sisters on half-holidays. He once went to the play with them, and wore a white waistcoat and a rose, which was considered among us equivalent to a declaration. We were of the opinion on that occasion that to the last moment he expected Maxby's father to ask him to dinner at 5 o'clock, and therefore neglected his own dinner at 1:30, and finally got none. We exaggerated in our imaginations the extent to which he punished Maxby's father's cold meat at supper, and we agreed to believe that he was elevated with wine and water when he came home. but we all liked him, for he had a good knowledge of boys, and would have made it a much better school if he had had any more power. He was writing master, mathematical master, English master, made out the bills, mended the pens, and did all sorts of things. He divided the little boys with the Latin master. They were smuggled through their rudimentary books at odd times when there was nothing else to do. And he always called at parents' houses to inquire after sick boys, because he had gentlemanly manners. He was rather musical, and on some remote quarter day had bought an old trombone, but a bit of it was lost, and it made the most extraordinary sounds when he sometimes tried to play it of an evening. His holidays never began on account of the bills until long after ours, but in the summer vacations he used to take pedestrian excursions with a knapsack, and at Christmas time he went to see his father at Chipping Norton, who, we all said, on no authority, was a dairy-fed pork butcher. Poor fellow! He was very low all day on Maxby's sister's wedding day, and afterwards was thought to favour Maxby more than ever, though he had been expected to spite him. He has been dead these 20 years, poor fellow. Our remembrance of our school presents the Latin master as a colourless, doubled-up, near-sighted man with a crutch, who was always cold and always putting onions into his ears for deafness, and always disclosing ends of flannel under all his garments, and almost always applying a ball of pocket-handkerchief to some part of his face with a screwing action round and round. He was a very good scholar, and took great pains where he saw intelligence and a desire to learn. Otherwise, perhaps not. Our memory presents him, unless teased into a passion, with as little energy as colour, as having been worried and tormented into monotonous feebleness, as having had the best part of his life ground out of him in a mill of boys. We remember with terror how he fell asleep one sultry afternoon with the little smuggled class before him, and awoke not when the footstep of the chief fell heavy on the floor, how the chief aroused him in the midst of a dread silence and said, "Mr. Blinkins, are you ill, sir?" How he blushingly replied, "Sir, rather so." How the chief retorted with severity, "Mr. Blinkins, this is no place to be ill in," which was very, very true, and walked back solemn as the ghost in Hamlet, until, catching a wandering eye, he called that boy for inattention, and happily expressed his feelings toward the Latin master through the medium of a substitute. There was a fat little dancing master who used to come in a gig and taught the more advanced among us hornpipes, as an accomplishment in great social demand in after life. And there was a brisk little French master who used to come in the sunniest weather with a handleless umbrella, and to whom the chief was always polite, because, as we believed, if the chief offended him, he would instantly address the chief in French, and forever confound him before the boys with his inability to understand a reply. There was, besides, a serving man whose name was Phil. Our retrospective glance presents Phil as a shipwrecked carpenter, cast away upon the desert island of a school, and carrying into practice an ingenious inkling of many trades. He mended whatever was broken, and made whatever was wanted. He was general glazier, among other things, and mended all the broken windows, at the prime cost, as was darkly rumoured among us, of 9d. For every square charged 3 and 6 to parents. We had a high opinion of his mechanical genius, and generally held that the chief knew something bad of him, and on pain of divulgence enforced Phil to be his bondsman. We particularly remember that Phil had a sovereign contempt for learning, which engenders in us a respect for his sagacity, as it implies his accurate observation of the relative positions of the chief and the ushers. He was an impenetrable man, who waited at table between whiles, and throughout the half kept the boxes in severe custody. He was morose even to the chief, and never smiled except at breaking up, when, in acknowledgment of the toast, "Success to Phil, hooray!" he would slowly carve a grin out of his wooden face, where it would remain until we were all gone. Nevertheless, one time when we had the scarlet fever in the school, Phil nursed all the sick boys of his own accord, and was like a mother to them. There was another school not far off, and of course our school could have nothing to say to that school. It is mostly the way with schools, whether of boys or men. Well, the railway has swallowed up ours, and the locomotives now run smoothly over its ashes. So fades and languishes, grows dim and dies, all that this world is proud of. And is not proud of, too. It had little reason to be proud of our school, and has done much better since in that way, and will do far better yet. End
Our
of section
School,
17.
from reprinted pieces.
Charles Dickens' 200th Anniversary Collection, Volume 2, by Charles Dickens. Our School. Recording by Joyce Martin.
Fireside Christmas Short Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fireside Christmas Short Stories by Various. Her Birthday Dream by Nellie C. King. Recording by Angela. Marcia Brownlow came out of the church and walked rapidly down the street. She seemed perturbed. Her gray eyes flashed, and on her cheeks glowed 2 red spots. She was glad she was not going home, so she wouldn't have to take a car, but could walk the short distance to Aunt Sophie's, where she had been invited to dine and visit with her special chum, Cousin Jack, who was home from college for the short Thanksgiving vacation. She slowed up as she reached her destination, and waited a little before going in. She wanted to get calmed down a bit, for she didn't want her friend to see her when she felt so riled up. Back of it was a secret reluctance to meet Jack. He was so different since the Gypsy Smith revival. Of course he was perfectly lovely and unchanged toward her, but somehow she felt uncomfortable in his presence, and she didn't enjoy having her self-satisfaction disturbed. As she entered the dining room, she was greeted with exclamations of surprise and pleasure. "Why, Marcia," said Aunt Sophia, "we had given you up. I almost never knew of your being late in keeping an appointment." "You must excuse me, Auntie, and lay this offense to the charge of our Sunday school superintendent," answered Marcia. "I suppose Mr. Robinson is laying his plans for Christmas," remarked Uncle John. "He believes in taking time by the forelock, and a very commendable habit it is, too." "Yes," answered Marcia laconically. Jack glanced at her keenly. "Is there anything new in the Christmas line?" he asked. The gray eyes grew black, and the red spots burned again as Marcia replied, "Well, I should think so. He proposes to turn things topsy-turvy." "My, what does he want to do?" inquired Cousin Augusta. "Oh, he calls it the White Gift Christmas, but the long and short of the matter is that he proposes to turn down Santa Claus and all the old time-honored customs connected with Christmas that are so dear to the hearts of the children, and have the school do the giving. He has a big banner hung up in the Sunday school room bearing the words, 'Gifts for the Christ Child.'" "An excellent idea," exclaimed Uncle John, "but I don't see much of an innovation about that. You have always made the children's giving a part of your Christmas celebration, have you not?" "Certainly," rejoined Marcia. "They have always brought their little gifts for the poor, and that is all right, but this time there are no gifts to the Sunday school at all." "Not even to the primary school?" asked Augusta. "Well," admitted Marcia, "Mr. Robinson gave the children their choice today, whether they would have the old Christmas or the White Gift Christmas, and they all voted for the new idea." "Why then should the children be obliged to have gifts if they don't want them?" laughed Augusta. "Oh, children are always taken with novelty, and Mr. Robinson told it to them in such a way that fancy was captivated, but I don't think they really understood what they were giving up." "Marcia, it seems to me that you are emphasizing the wrong side of the subject, if I understand it aright," said Jack. "Why, do you know about it?" asked Marcia in surprise. "Not much," replied Jack, "but I read the White Gift story in the Sunday School Times, and the report of the Painesville experiment." "Well, Jack, tell us what you know about this mysterious white gift," commanded his father. I would rather Marcia should tell it, Father. I know so little. Oh, go on, Jack, urged Marcia. You can't possibly know less about it than I do, for I confess I was so full of the disappointment of the little ones that the other side of it didn't impress me very much. Well, as I remember it, said Jack, the gist of the plan is this, that Christmas is Christ's birthday, and we should make our gifts to him instead of to one another. And the idea of the white gift was suggested by the story of the Persian king named Kubla Khan, who was a wise and good ruler, and greatly beloved. On his birthday his subjects kept what they called the White Feast. This was celebrated in an immense great white banqueting hall, and each one of his subjects brought to their king a white gift to express that the love and loyalty of their hearts was without stain. The rich brought white chargers, ivory, and alabaster. The poor brought white pigeons, or even a measure of rice, and the great king regarded all gifts alike so long as they were white. Have I told it right, cousin? Queried Jack. Yes, I think so. It is a beautiful thought, I must confess, and might be all right in a large, rich Sunday school, but in a mission school like ours I am sure it will be a failure. It will end in our losing our scholars. I don't believe in taking up new ideas without considering whether they are adapted to our needs or not. But please, dear folkses, don't let us say anything more about it, pleaded Marcia, and so the subject was dropped. That evening, as Jack Thornton bade his cousin good-bye, he placed in her hand a little package, saying, I'm so sorry, Marcia, that I can't be here for your birthday, but here's my remembrance. Now don't you dare open it before Tuesday, and, dear, you may be sure it is a white gift, and may you have a white birthday. And before she could say a word, he had opened the door and was gone. Touched by his thoughtful gift and his words, she said to herself, A white birthday! I always have perfectly beautiful birthdays. And so she did, for she was always looking out for other people's birthdays and making much of them, and so she always got the gospel measure. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together, and running over, shall man give into your bosom. But these thoughts were crowded out by the pressure of things to be done. Father and mother had gone into the country to visit a sick friend, and the younger brothers and sisters surrounded her and clamored for songs and Bible stories, and as she was a good older sister, she devoted herself to them until their bedtime. Then, turning out the lights, she sat down in an easy-chair before the library grate, and yielded herself to the spell of the quiet hour. The strained, irritated nerves relaxed, and a strange, sweet peace stole over her. As she gazed dreamily into the fire, a star seemed to rise out of the glowing coals and beam at her with a beautiful, soft radiance, and the words of the Evangel came into her mind. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding joy, and when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him, and when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. She repeated the words over and over to herself. How simple and restful they were! How direct and genuine and satisfying was this old-time giving! There it was, gifts for the Christ-child. They presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. She remembered reading somewhere that the gold represented our earthly possessions, the frankincense typified our service, and the myrrh our suffering for his sake. As she gazed into the fire and mused, she fell asleep, and all these thoughts were woven into the fabric of a dream. And who shall say that God does not speak to his children still in dreams? She dreamed that it was the morning of her birthday. She heard cheery voices in the hall calling out to one another, This is Marcia's birthday! Wish you many returns of the day! There was an excited running to and fro between the different rooms, and gleeful exclamations, but no one came near her. She sat up in bed listening, and wondering what it could mean. Why, Mother always came into her room, and folded her to her heart, and said those precious things that only a mother can say, and the children always scrambled to see who should be the first to give sister a birthday kiss. Were they playing some joke on her? She would be quiet and watch, and so not be taken unawares. Presently they went trooping happily downstairs into the dining room, and she heard Father's voice say, Good morning, children. I wish you many happy returns of Marcia's birthday. What did it all mean? Was she going crazy? Or were they just trying to surprise her by some novel way of celebrating her birthday? She arose and with trembling fingers dressed herself hastily, and stole softly down the stairs and looked into the dining room. Hush, Father was asking a blessing. He returned thanks for dear Marcia's birthday, and asked that it should be a happy day for them all. Beside each plate save her own were various packages, and these were opened amid ejaculations of surprise and pleasure, and sundry hugs and kisses. After the first burst of happiness had subsided, Marcia braced herself and entered the dining room, saying with forced gaiety, Good morning, dear ones all. They looked up with blank, unanswering faces and said, Good morning, Marcia. That was all. But Marcia's heart leaped at the recognition of her presence, for she had begun to fear that she was dead, and that it was her spirit that was wandering about. She stooped and kissed her mother, who murmured abstractedly, Yes, dear, never once looking up from the presents she was examining. With a sinking heart she turned away from her mother, and went and stood behind her father's chair, and leaning over, whispered in his ear, "Dear father, have you forgotten that this is my birthday?" He answered kindly but absent-mindedly, "Why, daughter, am I likely to forget it with all these tokens around me?" And he waved his hand toward the gifts piled around his plate. This was almost more than Marcia could bear, for father was always specially tender and attentive to her on her birthday. She always sat on his knee a while, and he told her what a joy and comfort she was to him, and he always paid her some pretty compliment that made her girlish heart swell with innocent pride, for every girl knows that compliments from one's father are a little sweeter than any others. In vain she hung around, waiting for some clue to this mysterious, unnatural conduct of the family. They were all absorbed in plans for spending this birthday, Marcia's birthday, but no reference whatever was made to what she liked. No one consulted her as to what she wanted to do or to have done. The boys were going skating in the forenoon. The little girls were to invite 4 of their friends to help serve the first dinner in the new doll's house, and in the afternoon father would take them all for an automobile ride into the country to a dear friend's, all but Marcia, who couldn't bear to get into an auto since a terrible accident she had been in a few weeks ago. A troop of her girl friends came in a conventional way wished her many happy returns of the day, and then proceeded to ignore her, and gave gifts to other members of the family. "It is a wonder," thought Marcia bitterly, "that they didn't have a birthday party for Marcia with Marcia left out." And so it went on all through that strange, miserable day. While they were all busy celebrating her birthday, she herself was neglected and ignored. As she sat in the quiet house alone in the twilight, for she had no heart to light the gas, just homesick for the personal love which had characterized all her birthdays and all her home life heretofore, there came a timid knock on the door, and as Marcia opened it, there stood little crippled Joe, one of her scholars in the Mission Sunday School. As he saw her, he gave a little exclamation of surprise and delight, and said, "Oh, Miss Marshie, I hearn last night 'twas your birthday today, and I wanted to guv yer something white, like Mr. Robinson he told us 'bout, don't yer know, and 'cause yer has allus treated me so white, and I didn't have nothin', and so I axed him, you know, what yer telled us 'bout in Sunday school, Jesus, who died on the cross, and who's allers willin' to help a poor feller, and I axed him to help me get something real nice and white for your birthday, and I kept me eyes peeled all day expectin' it, and just now a real swell feller buyed a paper of me, and then he guv me this here bunch of white sweet-smellin' posies 'thout my sayin' a word. Here they be, Miss Marshie, for yer. Jiminy, teacher, ain't them purty? And oh, teacher, he made 'em in the fust place, and had the man guv 'em to me, and so I reckon he and me's partners in this here white gift business." And he held up in his thin, grimy hand a bunch of white, sweet-scented violets. Marcia's first impulse was to catch up the little fellow and his gift in her arms and baptize them with a flood of tears from her own overcharged heart. But she hadn't taught boys in a Mission Sunday School class for nothing. Joe would have thought she had gone crazy, or been struck silly, or was sick unto death. So she controlled herself, and kneeling beside him took the violets reverently in both her hands, saying in a choked voice, "Joe, they are just beautiful. This is the only really truly white gift I have had today, and I don't deserve it, but I thank him and you." The boy looked at her with shining face, drew his hand across his eyes, and then answered brightly, "Oh, that's all right, Miss Marshie. 'Tenny right 'tis with me, and I reckon 'tis with him." And seizing his crutch, he hopped like a little sparrow through the door and onto the street, and she heard his boyish voice calling out, "Evening papers, last edition, all about the big graft exposure." Just then the big white touring car discharged its merry load at the door, and the house was filled with the chatter and laughter of the children. In vain she tried to find a quiet corner where she could be alone with her heart. It was impossible to escape from the hilarious celebration of her birthday. She was so glad when the children said good night and went off to bed and she could seek the quiet of her own room. As she bade her father good night, he said, "Well, daughter, I hope you have enjoyed your birthday and all your gifts." At this, all the honesty of her nature, all the hatred of sham, rose up in one indignant outburst, and she exclaimed, "I have had no gifts, neither has this been my birthday celebration." "Why, Marcia," said her father in an aggrieved tone, "this certainly is your birthday, and we have been very happy in keeping it for love of you." "I have failed to see any manifestation of love to me," retorted Marcia. "You may have had a happy time, but I have not been in it. You have given gifts to one another, but I have had just one," and she held up the bunch of violets. "This is a gift of love from little lame Joe in answer to his prayer and in pity for my hungry heart." There was silence in the room for a moment, and then her father answered, "It seems to me, daughter, that when you get right down to a personal application, what you believe in after all is a white birthday." The words went through her like an electric shock, and with a start she awoke and sat upright in her chair, and lo, it was all a dream. Marcia looked around the room, shook herself a little, stirred the fire, and put on fresh coal. She laughed at the remembrance of her dream and its absurdity. How glad she was that it was only a dream! But was it only a dream? Was it not a reality? Was not this the way she had kept the Lord's birthday? When she had opened her Christmas treasure, how much had been given Him, and for love of Him? How large a place had she given Him in the season's activity? Had she ever made room for Him as the central figure of it all, or had He been crowded out, and His rightful place given to Santa Claus and the world's merrymaking? In the light of the Spirit she saw that the Star of Bethlehem always leads to the cross of Calvary. She had never liked to think about the cross before, but now it was all illumined with the glory of the love which gave to us God's best, His only begotten Son. She remembered how the Lord Jesus had said, "If I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me." She saw that it is as we see Christ on the cross for us that we are drawn to Him. In that still hour, on her knees at the foot of the cross, Marcia, with great gladness, made her first white gift unto her Lord. She gave herself to Him. End of Her Birthday Dream by Nellie C. King.
Fireside Christmas Short Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fireside Christmas Short Stories by Various. The Eve of St. Nicholas by Faith Wynne. In a neat little house in an old-fashioned German village on the banks of the beautiful Rhine, with flat meadows and broad fields and roads bordered with tall poplars, there lived a happy family by the name of Lichtenfels. There were 2 daughters named Christine and Alice, the sunlight of the home where clouds were rare. 1 month, however, before the advent of St. Nicholas Day, something unusual occurred, and this something was a troubled pucker on the white forehead of little Alice, and as she watched the nimble fingers of Christine slipping the stitches off and on and off her shining needles, she sighed so deeply that the sister asked anxiously, "What ails thee, Liebchen?" "I am so afraid that St. Nicholas will ask me again this year if I can knit," she replied with a quiver in her voice. "So he will, Alice, so he will. And what canst thou answer? The mother wanted to teach thee, but thou wouldst not learn." "I know I was naughty not to obey. If I learn now, will St. Nicholas pardon me?" "I am sure he will." "Then I will learn before the month is out," said Alice, skipping after Christine to get the yarn and needles. And a pretty picture the mother found when she entered the room a while later. The smiling sisters were seated side by side on the wooden settee. Christine's arms were half bared, for it was one of those warm October days which Witherswill call the squirrel and the bee from out their winter home, and her fair head was bowed until it almost touched the flaxen locks of the child, her face eager and flushed as she guided the awkward little fingers through the stitches that seemed so determined to drop out of line. Patience and perseverance are fine partners, and generally accomplish their aim. When the eve of the 5th of November rolled around, Alice was ready to enjoy with an untroubled heart the sights in the window of the Konditorei confectioner's shop, where many little wooden-shod feet pattered that night to buy a chocolate shoe, and to admire the picture cakes of immense roosters with flowing tails and lordly crests, ladies in ruffs, and knights in armour with sword and lance, St. Nicholas on a white horse being the most frequent figure. These picture cakes are made in wooden moulds, thick square blocks of wood, with the form to be made deeply cut into them. The dough is pressed firmly into this cutting until it takes its shape, when it is removed and baked. most plentiful of all the pretty toys are little candy shoes, generally made of brown chocolate with white rosettes and trimmings, which are always expected to be provided to hold food for St. Nicholas's white horse when the good saint comes in the night with his gifts, and sad is the heart of the child who cannot find a groschen to buy one. There was such a one standing close to Christine, who whispered that she could not afford a chocolate shoe, so she had made one of potato and would put the oats in it, adding the fervent hope that St. Nicholas would not be angry. "Of course he will not," said Christine. "He will know you did your best, and that is all any of us can do." That night there were many children in this little village in a state of great excitement, filling the shoes for the white steed with rye or oats or sugar, and blacking their own until they could almost see themselves in them, which were then placed upon a table beside their beds, close to the chocolate shoes. This preparation is made with their hearts in their mouths, for they are expecting any moment to hear St. Nicholas's bell announcing his approach. Finally it comes, ting-a-ling-ling, sounding clearly in the still night air. The door is opened politely by the mother, who bids him enter. At one side he carries a long, well-filled bag, and in one hand a bundle of rods. He bows graciously, and says as Christmas is so near, the Christkind has sent him to each home to see where he must bring presents on that blessed day. He asks the trembling Alice, who clings to her mother's arm, whether she has yet learned to knit, and a smile passes over his face when she almost shrieks out in her excitement and earnestness, "Yes, yes, good St. Nicholas!" He then assures her that she and all the good children will find a gift from out his well-filled sack beside their beds in the morning, which will be as a promise to them that on Christmas Eve the Christ child will bring more beautiful presents. The day scarcely dawns before the village children begin to peep around, and alas for the naughty ones who find only a bundle of sticks. The good boys and girls, however, are delighted with the picture cakes that adorn the little stand at their bedside. Laid carefully across the top of Alice's shoe is a large cake made in the shape of a stocking, marked "For the little girl who has learned the useful art of knitting." And the potato shoe in a poorer part of the village is filled with the sweetest of sweets, and a card lay beside it, upon which was written, "She did the best she could." When Christmas Day came, with all its hopes and fears for the childish heart, the promises of St. Nicholas were fulfilled. The Christ child remembered the good with bounteous and beauteous gifts, and the birch rods left by old Pelt's Nicol we may believe kept the naughty children in order the next year. But, you know, that is not the most acceptable goodness which grows out of a desire of reward or fear of punishment. May the glad Christmas find you and keep you good, because it is right to be good. End of The Eve of St. Nicholas by Faith Wynne. Recording by Ruth Golding.
Fireside Christmas Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fireside Christmas Stories by Various. The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen. Recording by Sarah Swart. It was dreadfully cold. It was snowing fast and was almost dark as evening came on, the last evening of the year. In the cold and the darkness, there went along the street a poor little girl, bareheaded and with naked feet. When she left home, she had slippers on, it is true, but they were much too large for her feet, slippers that her mother had used until then, and the poor little girl lost them in running across the street when two carriages were passing terribly fast. When she looked for them, one was not to be found, and a boy seized the other and ran away with it, saying he would use it for a cradle some day. when he had children of his own. So on the little girl went, with her bare feet, that were red and blue with cold. In an old apron that she wore were bundles of matches, and she carried a bundle also in her hand. No one had bought so much as a bunch all day long, and no one had given her even a penny. Poor little girl! Shivering with cold and hunger, she crept along, a perfect picture of misery. The snowflakes fell on her long flaxen hair, which hung in pretty curls about her throat, but she thought not of her beauty, nor of the cold. Lights gleamed in every window, and there came to her the savory smell of roast goose, for it was New Year's Eve, and it was of this which she thought. In a corner formed by two houses, one of which projected beyond the other, she sat, cowering down. She had drawn under her little feet, but still she grew colder and colder. Yet she dared not go home, for she had sold no matches, and could not bring a penny of money. Her father would certainly beat her, and, besides, it was cold enough at home, for they had only the house roof above them, and though the largest holes had been stopped with straw and rags, there were left many through which the cold wind whistled, and now her little hands were nearly frozen with cold. Alas, a single match might do her good if she might only draw it from the bundle, rub it against the wall, and warm her fingers by it. So at last she drew one out. Whisht! How it blazed and burned! It gave out a warm, bright flame like a little candle, and she held her hands over it. A wonderful little light it was. It really seemed to the little girl as if she sat before a great iron stove with polished brass feet and brass shovel and tongs. So blessedly it burned that the little maiden stretched out her feet to warm them also. How comfortable she was! But lo, the flame went out, the stove vanished, and nothing remained but the little burned match in her hand. She rubbed another match against the wall. It burned brightly, and where the light fell upon the wall, it became transparent like a veil, so that she could see through it into the room. A snow-white cloth was spread upon the table, on which was a beautiful china dinner service, while a roast goose, stuffed with apples and prunes, steamed famously, and sent forth a most savory smell. And what was more delightful still, and wonderful, the goose jumped from the dish, with knife and fork still in its breast, and waddled along the floor straight to the little girl. But the match went out then, and nothing was left to her but the thick, damp wall. She lighted another match, and now she was under a most beautiful Christmas tree, larger and far more prettily trimmed than one she had seen through the glass doors at the rich merchants'. Hundreds of wax tapers were burning on the green branches, and gay figures, such as she had seen in the shop windows, looked down upon her. The child stretched out her hands to them. Then the match went out. Still the lights of the Christmas tree rose higher and higher. She saw them as stars in heaven, and one of them fell, forming a long trail of fire. Now someone is dying, murmured the child softly, for her grandmother, the only person who had loved her, and who was now dead, had told her that whenever a star falls, a soul mounts up to God. She struck yet another match against the wall, and again it was light, and in the brightness there appeared before her the dear old grandmother, bright and radiant, yet sweet and mild, and happy as she had never looked on earth. "Oh, grandmother!" cried the child, "take me with you. I know you will go away when the match burns out. You, too, will vanish, like the warm stove, the splendid New Year's feast, the beautiful Christmas tree." And lest her grandmother should disappear, she rubbed the whole bunch of matches against the wall. And the matches burned with such a brilliant light that it became brighter than noonday. Her grandmother had never looked so grand and beautiful. She took the little girl in her arms, and both flew together, joyously and gloriously, mounting higher and higher, far above the earth. And for them there was neither hunger, nor cold, nor care. They were with God. But in the corner, at the dawn of day, sat the poor girl, leaning against the wall, with red cheeks and smiling mouth, frozen to death on the last evening of the old year. Stiff and cold she sat, with the matches, one bundle of which was burned. She wanted to warm herself, poor little thing, people said. No one imagined what sweet visions she had had, or how gloriously she had gone with her grandmother to enter upon the joys of a new year. End of The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen. Recording by Sarah Swart.
Fireside Christmas Short Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fireside Christmas Short Stories by Various. The Star by Florence M. Kingsley. Recording by Pam Castile. Once upon a time, in a country far away from here, there lived a little girl named Ruth. Ruth's home was not at all like our houses, for she lived in a little tower on top of the great stone wall that surrounded the town of Bethlehem. Ruth's father was the hotel keeper. The Bible says the innkeeper. This inn was not at all like our hotels either. There was a great open yard, which was called the courtyard. All about this yard were little rooms, and each traveler who came to the hotel rented one. The inn stood near the great stone wall of the city, so that as Ruth stood one night looking out of the tower window, she looked directly into the courtyard. It was truly a strange sight that met her eyes. So many people were coming to the inn, for the king had made a law that every man should come back to the city where his father used to live to be counted and to pay his taxes. Some of the people came on the backs of camels, with great rolls of bedding and their dishes for cooking upon the back of the beast. Some of them came on little donkeys, and on their backs too were the bedding and the dishes. Some of the people came walking. Slowly, they were so tired. Many miles some of them had come. As Ruth looked down into the courtyard, she saw the camels being led to their places by their masters. She heard the snap of the whips. She saw the sparks shoot up from the fires that were kindled in the courtyard, where each person was preparing his own supper. She heard the cries of the tired, hungry little children. Presently her mother, who was cooking supper, came over to the window and said, "Ruthie, thou shalt hide in the house until all these people are gone. Dost thou understand?" "Yes, my mother," said the child, and she left the window to follow her mother back to the stove, limping painfully, for little Ruth was a cripple. Her mother stooped suddenly and caught the child in her arms. "My poor little lamb, it was a mule's kick just 6 years ago that hurt your poor back and made you lame." "Never mind, my mother. My back does not ache today, and lately, when the light of the strange new star has shone down upon my bed, my back has felt so much stronger, and I have felt so happy, as though I could climb upon the rays of the star and up into the sky and above the stars." Her mother shook her head sadly. "Thou art not likely to climb much, now or ever. But come, the supper is ready. Let us go to find your father. I wonder what keeps him." They found the father standing at the gate of the courtyard, talking to a man and woman who had just arrived. The man was tall, with a long beard, and he led by a rope a snow-white mule, on which sat the drooping figure of the woman. As Ruth and her mother came near, they heard the father say, "But I tell thee that there is no more room at the inn. Hast thou no friends where thou canst go to spend the night?" The man shook his head. "No, none," he answered. "I care not for myself, but my poor wife." Little Ruth pulled at her mother's dress. "Mother, the oxen sleep out under the stars these warm nights, and the straw in the caves is clean and warm. I have made a bed there for my little lamb." Ruth's mother bowed before the tall man. "Thou didst hear the child. It is as she says. The straw is clean and warm." The tall man bowed his head. "We shall be very glad to stay." And he helped the sweet-faced woman down from the donkey's back, and led her away to the cave stable, while the little Ruth and her mother hurried up the stairs that they might send a bowl of porridge to the sweet-faced woman, and a sup of new milk as well. That night, when little Ruth lay down in her bed, the rays of the beautiful new star shone through the window more brightly than before. They seemed to soothe the tired, aching shoulders. She fell asleep and dreamed that the beautiful bright star burst, and out of it came countless angels who sang in the night, "Glory to God in the highest, peace on earth, good will to men." And then it was morning, and her mother was bending over her and saying, "Awake, awake, little Ruth, mother has something to tell thee." Then as the eyes opened slowly, "The angels came in the night, little one, and left a baby to lay beside your little white lamb in the manger." That afternoon Ruth went with her mother to the fountain. The mother turned aside to talk to the other women of the town about the strange things heard and seen the night before. But Ruth went on and sat down by the edge of the fountain. The child was not frightened, for strangers came often to the well, but never had she seen men who looked like the three who now came towards her. The first one, a tall man with a long white beard, came close to Ruth and said, "Canst tell us, child, where is born he that is called the King of the Jews?" "I know of no king," she answered. "But last night, while the star was shining, the angels brought a baby to lie beside my white lamb in the manger." The stranger bowed his head. "That must be he. Wilt thou show us the way to him, my child?" So Ruth ran, and her mother led the three men to the cave, and when they saw the child, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy, and opening their gifts, they presented unto him gold and frankincense and myrrh, with wonderful jewels, so that Ruth's mother's eyes shone with wonder. But little Ruth saw only the baby, which lay asleep on its mother's breast. "If only I might hold him in my arms," she thought, but was afraid to ask. After a few days the strangers left Bethlehem, all but the three, the man whose name was Joseph, and Mary his wife, and the baby. Then, as of old, little Ruth played about the courtyard, and the white lamb frolicked at her side. Often she dropped to her knees to press the little woolly white head against her breast, while she murmured, "My little lamb, my very, very own, I love you, lammie." And then together they would steal over to the entrance of the cave to peep in at the baby, and always she thought, "If I only might touch his hand," but was afraid to ask. One night as she lay in her bed she thought to herself, "Oh, I wish I had a beautiful gift for him, such as the wise men brought, but I have nothing at all to offer, and I love him so much." Just then the light of the star, which was nightly fading, fell across the foot of the bed and shone full upon the white lamb which lay asleep at her feet. And then she thought of something. The next morning she arose with her face shining with joy. She dressed carefully, and with the white lamb held close to her breast, went slowly and painfully down the stairway and over to the door of the cave. "I have come," she said, "to worship him, and I have brought him my white lamb." The mother smiled at the lame child. Then she lifted the baby from her breast and placed him in the arms of the little maid who knelt at her feet. A few days after, an angel came to the father Joseph and told him to take the baby and hurry to the land of Egypt, for the wicked king wanted to do it harm. And so these three, the father, mother, and baby, went by night to the far country of Egypt. And the star grew dimmer and dimmer, and passed away forever from the skies over Bethlehem. But little Ruth grew straight and strong and beautiful as the almond trees in the orchard, and all the people who saw her were amazed, for Ruth was once a cripple. It was the light of the strange star, her mother said, but little Ruth knew it was the touch of the blessed Christ child who was once folded against her heart. End of The Star by Florence M. Kingsley. Recording by Pam Castile.
Fireside Christmas Short Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fireside Christmas Short Stories by Various. The Snowman by Alfred B. Cooper. I've double reason, good and bad, for remembering the Christmas of 1890 something, because, while it was the most humiliating day of my life, it ended my career as a swell cracksman, and was the commencement of my better days. I'd long had my eye on Wharton Manor as a crib worth the cracking, and as I never was the mere midnight marauder who is popularly supposed to lurk under the bed until the family is asleep, I thought the dinner hour on Christmas Eve a favourable opportunity for taking my pick of the jewel cases of Lord Wharton's guests, and for annexing the unconsidered trifles that doubtless strewed their dressing tables. I did not forget that some of the most valuable articles would at that moment be enhancing the charms of their fair owners, but as I always worked single-handed and could not hope to carry away a vanload, I reckoned upon picking up sufficient to pay me handsomely for my trouble. Audacity is half the battle in artistic burglary. I always trusted to my wits, and I will say this for myself, I never carried a weapon of any kind. I took the fortunes of war and considered that, if I were dolt enough to walk into a trap, or let another man's wits outwit mine, or another man's legs outrun mine, I ought to yield him the palm like a gentleman. And it was the fact that things panned out so differently from anything I could have foreseen. But that's the end of the story, and we are still at the beginning. Christmas 1890 something was the snowiest in my memory. It was a real Christmas card Christmas, and as I stood in the deep shadow of a yew within 40 yards of the manor, the scene pleased my artistic eye not a little. The great hall door was wide open in spite of the severity of the weather, for it was a still night, and a flood of rosy light from the crimson-covered lamps and fairy lights streamed out upon the drive. Low lights, too, burned in most of the upper windows, but as the whole house party was at dinner they revealed no sign of life within. The drive swept round to my right as I faced the house. Having studied the geography of the neighbourhood, I knew where it was, certainly, or I should have had difficulty in locating it. A line of yew trees, similar to the one behind which I stood, was planted at intervals along the near edge of the drive, and the opposite side was bounded by a broad stone balustrade, something like the parapet of Waterloo Bridge, though not nearly so high. This stone fence was a beautiful ornament to the manor, and was admired by everybody, but, strangely enough, it was for use even more than ornament. The manor stood high, and the ground to the right fell away very suddenly into a deep dingle. This dingle was full of bracken and brambles which filled the spaces between the young trees, but the rock cropped out here and there and made it a dangerous place on a dark night. That was the reason of the stone balustrade. Farther down the drive the ravine shallowed off, and winding paths went in and out, which made it a very jolly place in the summer. When first I took my position of observation behind the yew, I got a fright. Casting my eyes towards the balustrade, I saw what I thought was a man looking directly at me. It was the hat that made the figure appear so real, yet I could have laughed aloud at my fears the next minute. It was a man indeed, but it was a man of snow, built on the coping of the balustrade in imitation of a statue. The house was full of young fellows and girls, with a fair sprinkling of small boys. Lord Wharton had no fewer than 6 of his own, and they had spent the morning, all the lot of them, setting up this effigy just for the fun of the thing. This figure could not be seen from the front door, because the sweep of the drive brought the yews into the line of sight. From where I stood, however, I could have knocked his old silk hat off with a snowball, and, such are the mad impulses of our poor human nature, I could have found it in my heart almost to have had a shy. Of course I did no such thing, for I could see by the dishes the flunkeys were carrying in that dinner was getting on, and that I was much later at my post than I had intended to be. I must bestir myself if I meant business. Business! Yes, it was my business then, I'm sorry to say, and no easy business either. Yet I knew exactly what I was going to attempt and how I meant to attempt it. There was nothing original in the plan. Ivy and an open window summed it up. The back of the house would doubtless have been safer, but then my booty was in front, and at such an hour it would have been 10 times more risky to traverse the house from back to front than to go boldly in at an upper front window. Behold me, then, 10 minutes later, stealthily peering into a dimly lighted room most luxuriously furnished. I had experienced more difficulty than usual, for I was as nimble as a cat, in negotiating the ivy, because I wore a long, lightish coloured overcoat, made necessary by my tendency to rheumatism. Only a couple of candles in candlesticks of beaten silver served to light the room, but I could see the gleam of jewels and rich ornaments on the dressing table, half hidden by a heavy curtain which hung from a sort of carved oaken bracket branching from the wall. I stepped inside upon the thick pile of the carpet, and stole noiselessly towards the glittering table. The next moment you might have knocked me down with a feather. Behind the curtain, quickly pocketing the smallest and most valuable objects he could see, was a man in evening dress, a big man, half as big again as myself, but with Gentleman's Valley written all over him. We were not 4 feet apart, and the gasp of astonishment I gave was enough to make him nearly jump out of his skin. His dismay was only momentary. He knew the next instant what I was there for, and was evidently as quick-witted as I, for, before I could say "peas," he had darted between the wall and the curtain, banged the window into its place, and yelled, "Thieves! Thieves! Thieves!" a truer plural than anyone imagined, at the very top of his voice. For the wink of an eyelid I meant to tackle him, but what was the use? Moments were mighty precious just then, and even while he was shouting, the sly wretch, I turned and bolted for the door, intending to make a dash through the camp of the enemy and trust to my heels to get clear away. As bad luck would have it, as I turned the bend of the stairs that brought me in full view of the brilliantly lighted hall, I ran full tilt against a big flunkey with a tray of wine glasses. Talk about a shindy! A gas explosion would scarcely have made more noise. Broken glass, clattering tray, and the bumpety bump of 2 heavy bodies falling downstairs was something to remember. I fell uppermost, and giving myself a bounce up, with a prod below the belt which knocked the remaining wind out of the footman, I made for the door again as if a legion had been behind me. Nor was it mere fancy, for in truth a legion was behind me. The valet's big voice must have penetrated to the dining room, and the tremendous clatter of the footman and my luckless self caused by the downfall brought the party out like a swarm of bees. "Thieves!" came like a thunderclap from the top of the stairs. The valet was playing the game to perfection. I had 30 yards start, but I knew that among the guests would be many a young athlete from the 'varsities, men who could do their 100 in even time, soccer and rugger men who were accustomed to rough and tumble, so my chances of getting clear away were none too rosy. Besides, the whole party were lighter shod and clad than I, and I knew that these young fellows, though in no rig for snow, would not care a straw about ruining their dress shoes. I got round the sweep of the drive and was in the straight. It was 300 yards to the great gate, and cover, except the yews, was scarce. A gleam of lanterns ahead decided me. My way was blocked. Meanwhile my wits had been working at express speed. It was snowing again in heavy flakes. I purposely fell headlong into the snow piled on the edge of the drive, rolled over and over, and clutched an armful of it to my body and shoulders. I then scrambled up, leapt upon the stone balustrade, snatched the old silk hat, all snow–covered, from the head of the snowman, gave that unfortunate effigy a shove which toppled it neck and crop into the depths of the dingle, and myself dropped upon my knees on the top of the snowy foundation it had left behind it. It was the work of 5 seconds at the most, and there was I, with the snow–crowned hat over my eyes, my overcoat thickly caked with snow, and my legs wholly invisible, posing in the room and stead of the man of snow. The hue and cry went past me like a whirlwind, half a dozen flunkeys in their knee–breeches and yellow stockings bringing up the rear. They ran full speed 30 yards past my post of observation into a band of waits with lanterns and instruments from the village. These yokels were ready to turn and fly themselves when they saw the strange exodus from the manor, thinking, no doubt, that all the ghosts of which the old house was well known to be the trysting–place had suddenly appeared, not in singles but in battalions, and scared the guests away from their dinner and out of their 5 senses. But the sudden halt didn't help me in the least. The dilemma was distinctly mutual, and I did not bless the waits one little bit. Had the thief gone down the drive they would surely have seen him. It was a perfect mystery how he could possibly have dodged them. He had been seen in full flight round the bend. He must either have gone over into the dingle, a most unlikely course if he knew what he was doing, or he was hiding behind the yews. Then commenced a game of hide and seek. I nearly burst with laughter as I saw this mixed company dodge in and out among the sombre trees and catch at each other convulsively, each thinking the other a burglar. But there was no opportune opening for me. All I could do was to kneel stock still. One of the waits pointed me out. His attitude showed terror, though I could not see his face. The laugh that greeted his find sent him behind a yew tree on a fresh trail and very greatly reassured me. I evidently looked my part. Just then there was another arrival, the local policeman, and a big man in plain clothes, whom I guessed was a tech. Lord Wharton and some of the guests were in a group near me when they came along, and I heard the whole colloquy. Their arrival at that moment was quite unconnected with my affair, but it seemed to fit into the circumstances as detailed by his lordship in a few sentences. I heard the tech say, "He's a very old hand, known commonly as Toff Smith, but his real name is Charles Markland. He's wanted for a dozen big jobs, and I've had almost certain advice that he's somewhere in this neighbourhood." "It'll be he," said his lordship, "but he has been baulked this time. Lieutenant Fontenoy's valet was too quick for him. He has got away in the most amazing fashion, but it's a comfort to know that he has gone empty–handed." I'd heard of Toff Smith. He was one of the bigwigs of the profession, a perfect Napoleon of burglary, but it goes without saying I was not he. So I was now not only personating a snowman, but involuntarily standing in the shoes of Toff Smith as well. "He's got clear away," one cried. "Why trouble further? James tells me he did not have time to pick up a pin. Let us have a lark while we're out." I guessed it was Lieutenant Fontenoy who spoke, and all the youngsters, who had enjoyed the whole thing immensely, set up a shout, for he had evidently suggested something. "Cockshies! Pay your penny and take your chance. Now then, fair and square. No, don't cross the drive. Who'll knock his hat off first? Take your choice, cocoanut or cigar. I'm frozen to death. It'll warm us up." These were the cries I heard, but I didn't at the first blush tumble to their meaning. The ladies, clad in thick wraps, were at the windows all this time, where they could look along the drive and get news of the search. Now I heard them laugh merrily as a small boy ran across and made some communication to them. I quickly learned what it was. They were to witness a bombardment. The whole band, guests and waits, the police had hurried off, were gathered together about 20 yards from where I knelt, and at the word of command they let fly. I have enjoyed snowballing in my time, but that was when I had a chance of potting my opponent in the nape of the neck when he was stooping for ammunition. But to be the sole target for 30 well-directed missiles per second is another story. Move I dared not. I must grin and bear it, or, failing that, bear it without grinning. I had jammed the beastly old hat too tightly over my cranium for it to be easily dislodged, and the fun in consequence waxed fast and furious. By degrees discipline broke down, and the set distance was no longer regarded. Snowballs innumerable came at me from a range of a few yards with terrific force. Recognition was quickly put out of the question, for had I been a veritable snowman I could not have looked more like one. Every snowball that hit, and few, indeed, missed, left its contribution to my make-up, and I was shortly in peril of suffocation from the accumulation of snow about my mouth and nostrils, and almost equally in danger of temporary blindness, but that the hat rim protected me enough, at least, to keep half an eye intact. Had not the top of the wall been broad and I on my knees, I must inevitably have gone over willy-nilly, but hitherto I had kept my place, and I meant to continue to do so, for the fall backwards had greater terrors for me even than remaining where I was. But now the clapping of fair hands, the exhilarating exercise, the excitement of the last 20 minutes, and the spirit of mad revel which enters into the hearts of all men occasionally, wrought my doom. The weights, as aforementioned, had been pressed into the fray. It was Christmas time, and class distinctions went by the board. Even the man who played the big bass viol had propped his instrument against a tree and joined in the sport. But now, like me, they were to be sorry they had come. Half a dozen young sparks, to vary the amusement, seized the big bass fiddle, and the youngsters fought for clarinet, hautboy, ovi-clyde, euphonium, and trombone. Then, to the sound of a wild, unearthly pibroch, they levelled the bass fiddle like a battering ram and charged for the supposed snowman with shouts of laughter, thinking to demolish it finally and end the sport. I saw it coming, and I knew that the bottom end of a bass fiddle has an ugly spike, which might put an end to my career more surely than the dingle. I never waited for the shock. I went down without a touch, and, rolling over and over down the steep bank, I only remember thinking I should never stop, and then nothing. How I got to Everledge, a small town 5 miles away, I never rightly knew. I came to myself in the dingle while it was still dark, with pains in every limb. The nurse at the cottage hospital, bless her, tells me that I was picked up in an apparently dying state, and everybody sympathised with my being lost in the snow. I never told her the truth. How could I, when she was so kind and good? But if she had guessed why I was so interested in the district weekly paper, she might have suspected something. Here is the conclusion of the paragraph which took my eye. This is one of the most cunning robberies on record. The detectives think the whole affair was a put-up job on the part of Toff Smith, Lieutenant Fontenoy's valet, who left a most impudent note behind him, for while the party were all disporting themselves with the snowman, or applauding from the windows, he got clear away with £3,000 worth of jewellery. End of The Snowman by Alfred B. Cooper.
Section 9. Charles Dickens' 200th Anniversary Collection, Volume 2, The Lost Arctic Voyagers, Part 1, from Household Words. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joyce Martin. The Lost Arctic Voyagers. Dr. Rae may be considered to have established, by the mute but solemn testimony of the relics he has brought home, that Sir John Franklin and his party are no more. But there is one passage in his melancholy report, some examination into the probabilities and improbabilities of which we hope will tend to the consolation of those who take the nearest and dearest interest in the fate of that unfortunate expedition, by leading to the conclusion that there is no reason whatever to believe that any of its members prolonged their existence by the dreadful expedient of eating the bodies of their dead companions. Quite apart from the very loose and unreliable nature of the Eskimo representations, on which it would be necessary to receive with great caution even the commonest and most natural occurrence, we believe we shall show that close analogy and the mass of experience are decidedly against the reception of any such statement, and that it is in the highest degree improbable that such men as the officers and crews of the two lost ships would or could, in any extremity of hunger, alleviate the pains of starvation by this horrible means. Before proceeding to the discussion, we will premise that we find no fault with Dr. Rae, and that we thoroughly acquit him of any trace of blame. He has himself openly explained that his duty demanded that he should make a faithful report to the Hudson's Bay Company or the Admiralty of every circumstance stated to him, that he did so as he was bound to do without any reservation, and that his report was made public by the Admiralty, not by him. It is quite clear that if it were an ill-considered proceeding to disseminate this painful idea on the worst of evidence, Dr. Rae is not responsible for it. It is not material to the question that Dr. Rae believes in the alleged cannibalism. He does so merely on the substance of information obtained at various times and various sources, which is before us all. At the same time, we will most readily concede that he has all the rights to defend his opinion, which his high reputation as a skillful and intrepid traveler of great experience in the Arctic regions, combined with his manly, conscientious, and modest personal character, can possibly invest him with. Of the propriety of his immediate return to England with the intelligence he had got together, we are fully convinced. As a man of sense and humanity, he perceived that the first and greatest account to which it could be turned was the prevention of the useless hazard of valuable lives, and no one could better know in how much hazard all lives are placed that follow Franklin's track, than he who had made 8 visits to the Arctic shores. With these remarks we can release Dr. Rae from this inquiry, proud of him as an Englishman, and happy in his safe return home to well-earned rest. The following is the passage in the report to which we invite attention. Some of the bodies had been buried, probably those of the first victims of famine. Some were in a tent or tents, others under the boat, which had been turned over to form a shelter, and several lay scattered about in different directions. Of those found on the island, one was supposed to have been an officer, as he had a telescope strapped over his shoulders, and his double-barreled gun lay underneath him. From the mutilated state of many of the corpses, and the contents of the kettles, it is evident that our wretched countrymen had been driven to the last resource, cannibalism, as a means of prolonging existence. None of the Eskimo with whom I conversed had seen the whites, nor had they ever been at the place where the bodies were found, but had their information from those who had been there and who had seen the party when traveling. We have stated our belief that the extreme improbability of this inference as to the last resource can be rested, first on close analogy, and secondly on broad general grounds, quite apart from the improbabilities and incoherencies of the Eskimo evidence, which is itself given at the very best at second hand. More than this, we presume it to have been given at second hand through an interpreter, and he was in all probability imperfectly acquainted with the language he translated to the white man. We believe that few, if any, Eskimo tribes speak one common dialect, and Franklin's own experience of his interpreters in his former voyage was that they and the Eskimo were encountered understood each other tolerably, an expression which he frequently uses in his book, with the evident intention of showing that their communication was not altogether satisfactory. But even making the very large admission that Dr. Ray's interpreter perfectly understood what he was told, there yet remains the question whether he could render it into language of corresponding weight and value. We recommend any reader who does not perceive the difficulty of doing so and the skill required, even when a copious and elegant European language is in question, to turn to the accounts of the trial of Queen Caroline and to observe the constant discussions that arose, sometimes very important, in reference to the worth in English of words used by the Italian witnesses. There still remains another consideration, and a grave one, which is that 99 interpreters out of 100, whether savage, half-savage, or wholly civilized, interpreting to a person of superior station and attainments, will be under a strong temptation to exaggerate. This temptation will always be strongest precisely where the person interpreted to is seen to be the most excited and impressed by what he hears, for in proportion as he is moved, the interpreter's importance is increased. We have ourselves had an opportunity of inquiring whether any part of this awful information, the unsatisfactory result of various times and various sources, was conveyed by gestures. It was so, and the gesture described us, as often repeated, that of the informant setting his mouth to his own arm, would quite as well describe a man having opened one of his veins and drunk of the stream that flowed from it. If it be inferred that the officer who lay upon his double-barreled gun defended his life to the last against ravenous seamen under the boat or elsewhere, and that he died in so doing, how came his body to be found? That was not eaten, or even mutilated according to the description. Neither were the bodies buried in the frozen earth, disturbed. And is it not likely that if any bodies were resorted to as food, those the most removed from recent life and companionship would have been the first? Was there any fuel in that desolate place for cooking the contents of the kettles? If none, would the little flame of the spirit lamp the travelers may have had with them have sufficed for such a purpose? If not, would the kettles have been defiled for that purpose at all? Some of the corpses, Dr. Ray adds in a letter to the Times, had been sadly mutilated and had been stripped by those who had the misery to survive them, and who were found wrapped in 2 or 3 suits of clothes. Had there been no bears thereabout to mutilate those bodies, no wolves, no foxes, most probably the scurvy, known to be the dreadfulest scourge of Europeans in those latitudes, broke out among the party, virulent as it would inevitably be under such circumstances. It would of itself cause dreadful disfigurement, woeful mutilation, but more than that, it would not only soon annihilate the desire to eat, especially to eat flesh of any kind, but would annihilate the power. Lastly, no man can, with any show of reason, undertake to affirm that this sad remnant of Franklin's gallant band were not set upon and slain by the Eskimo themselves. It is impossible to form an estimate of the character of any race of savages from their deferential behavior to the white man while he is strong. The mistake has been made again and again, and the moment the white man has appeared in the new aspect of being weaker than the savage has changed and sprung upon him. There are pious persons who, in their practice, with a strange inconsistency, claim for every child born to civilization all innate depravity, and for every savage born to the woods and wilds all innate virtue. We believe every savage to be in his heart covetous, treacherous, and cruel, and we have yet to learn what knowledge the white man, lost, houseless, shipless, apparently forgotten by his race, plainly famine-stricken, weak, frozen, helpless, and dying, has of the gentleness of Eskimo nature. Leaving, as we propose, this part of the subject with a glance, let us put a supposititious case. If a little band of British naval officers, educated and trained exactly like the officers of this ill-fated expedition, had, on a former occasion, in command of a party of men vastly inferior to the crews of these 2 ships, penetrated to the same regions, and been exposed to the rigors of the same climate, if they had undergone such fatigue, exposure, and disaster that scarcely power remained to them to crawl, and they tottered and fell many times in a journey of a few yards, if they could not bear the contemplation of their filth and wretchedness, each other's emaciated figures, ghastly countenances, dilated eyeballs, and spectral voices, if they had eaten their shoes, such outer clothes as they could part with, and not perish of cold, the scraps of acrid marrow yet remaining in the dried and whitened spines of dead wolves, if they had wasted away to skeletons on such fare, and on bits of putrid skin, and bits of hide, and the covers of guns, and pounded bones, if they had passed through all the pangs of famine, had reached that point of starvation where there is little or no pain left, and had descended so far into the valley of the shadow of death that they lay down side by side, calmly and even cheerfully awaiting their release from this world, if they had suffered such dire extremity, and yet lay where the bodies of their dead companions lay unburied, within a few paces of them, and yet never dreamed at the last gasp of resorting to this said last resource, would it not be strong presumptive evidence against an incoherent Eskimo story, collected at various times, as it wandered from various sources? But if the leader of that party were the leader of this very party too, if Franklin himself had undergone those dreadful trials, and had been restored to health and strength, and had been, not for days and months alone, but years, the chief of this very expedition, infusing into it, as such a man necessarily must, the force of his character and discipline, patience and fortitude, would there not be a still greater and stronger moral improbability to set against the wild tales of a herd of savages? Now, this was Franklin's case. He had passed through the ordeal we have described. He was the chief of that expedition, and he was the chief of this. In this he commanded a body of picked English seamen of the first class. In that he and his 3 officers had but one English seaman to rely on, the rest of the men being Canadian voyageurs and Indians. His narrative of a journey to the shores of the Polar Sea in 1819-22 is one of the most explicit and enthralling in the whole literature of voyage and travel. The facts are acted and suffered before the reader's eyes in the descriptions of Franklin, Richardson, and Bach, 3 of the greatest names in the history of heroic endurance. See how they gradually sink into the depths of misery. "I was reduced," says Franklin, "long before the worst came, almost to skin and bone, and like the rest of the party suffered from degrees of cold that would have been disregarded whilst in health and vigor. I set out with the intention of going to St. Germain, to hasten his operations, making a canoe, but though he was only 3/4 of a mile distant, I spent 3 hours in a vain attempt to reach him, my strength being unequal to the labor of wading through the deep snow, and I returned quite exhausted, and much shaken by the numerous falls I had got. My associates were all in the same debilitated state. The voyageurs were somewhat stronger than ourselves, but more indisposed to exertion on account of their despondency. The sensation of hunger was no longer felt by any of us, yet we were scarcely able to converse upon any other subject than the pleasures of eating. We had a small quantity of this weed, tripe de roche, and always the cause of miserable illness to some of them, in the evening, and the rest of our supper was made up of scraps of roasted leather. The distance walked to-day was 6 miles. Previous to setting out, the whole party ate the remains of their old shoes, and whatever scraps of leather they had, to strengthen their stomachs for the fatigue of the day's journey. Not being able to find any tripe de roche, we drank an infusion of the Labrador tea plant, and ate a few morsels of burnt leather for supper. We were unable to raise the tent, and found its weight too great to carry it on. We therefore cut it up, and took a part of the canvas for a cover. Thus, growing weaker and weaker every day, they reached at last Fort Enterprise, a lonely and desolate hut, where Richardson, then Dr. Richardson, now Sir John, and Hepburn, the English seaman from whom they had been parted, rejoined them. We were all shocked at beholding the emaciated countenances of the doctor and Hepburn, as they strongly evidenced their extremely debilitated state. The alteration in our appearance was equally distressing to them, for since the swellings had subsided, we were little more than skin and bone. The doctor particularly remarked the spectral tone of our voices, which he requested us to make more cheerful, if possible, quite unconscious that his own partook of the same key. In the afternoon Peltier was so much exhausted that he sat up with difficulty and looked piteously. At length he slided from his stool upon the bed, as we supposed to sleep, and in this composed state he remained upwards of 2 hours without our apprehending any danger. We were then alarmed by hearing a rattling in his throat, and on the doctor examining him he was found to be speechless. He died in the course of the night. Simondre sat up the greater part of the day, and even assisted in pounding some bones, but on witnessing the melancholy state of Peltier, he became very low, and began to complain of cold and stiffness of the joints. Being unable to keep up a sufficient fire to warm him, we laid him down and covered him with several blankets. He did not, however, appear to get better, and I deeply lament to add he also died before daylight. We removed the bodies of the deceased into the opposite part of the house, but our united strength was inadequate to the task of interring them, or even carrying them down to the river. The severe shock occasioned by the sudden dissolution of our 2 companions rendered us very melancholy. Adam, one of the interpreters, became low and despondent, a change which we lamented the more as we perceived he had been gaining strength and spirits for the 2 preceding days. I was particularly distressed by the thought that the labor of collecting wood must now devolve upon Dr. Richardson and Hepburn, and that my debility would disable me from affording them any material assistance. Indeed, both of them most kindly urged me not to make the attempt. I found it necessary in their absence to remain constantly near Adam, and to converse with him in order to prevent his reflecting on our condition, and to keep up his spirits as far as possible. I also lay by his side at night. The doctor and Hepburn were getting much weaker, and the limbs of the latter were now greatly swelled. They came into the house frequently in the course of the day to rest themselves, and when once seated were unable to rise without the help of one another or of a stick. Adam was for the most part in the same low state as yesterday, but sometimes he surprised us by getting up and walking with an appearance of increased strength. His looks were now wild and ghastly, and his conversation was often incoherent. I may here remark that owing to our loss of flesh, the hardness of the floor, from which we were only protected by a blanket, produced soreness over the body, and especially those parts on which the weight rested in lying. Yet to turn ourselves for relief was a matter of toil and difficulty. However, during this period, and indeed all along after the acute pangs of hunger, which lasted but a short time, had subsided, we generally enjoyed the comfort of a few hours' sleep. The dreams which for the most part, but not always, accompanied it were usually, though not invariably, of a pleasant character, being very often about the enjoyments of feasting. In the daytime we fell into the practice of conversing on common and light subjects, although we sometimes discoursed with seriousness and earnestness on topics connected with religion. We generally avoided speaking directly of our present sufferings, or even of the prospect of relief. I observed that in proportion as our strength decayed, our minds exhibited symptoms of weakness, evidenced by a kind of unreasonable pettishness with each other. Each of us thought the other weaker in intellect than himself, and more in need of advice and assistance. So trifling a circumstance as a change of place, recommended by one as being warmer and more comfortable, and refused by the other from a dread of motion, frequently called forth fretful expressions, which were no sooner uttered than atoned for, to be repeated, perhaps, in the course of a few minutes. The same thing often occurred when we endeavored to assist each other in carrying wood to the fire. None of us were willing to receive assistance, although the task was disproportioned to our strength. On one of these occasions Hepburn was so convinced of this waywardness that he exclaimed, "Dear me, if we are spared to return to England, I wonder if we shall recover our understandings." Surely it must be comforting to the relatives and friends of Franklin and his brave companions, in later dangers now at rest, to reflect upon this manly and touching narrative. to consider that at the time it so affectingly describes, and all the weaknesses of which it so truthfully depicts, the bodies of the dead lay within reach, preserved by the cold, but unmutilated, and to know it for an established truth that the sufferers had passed the bitterness of hunger and were then dying passively. They knew the end they were approaching very well, as Franklin's account of the arrival of their deliverance next day shows. Adam had passed a restless night, being disquieted by gloomy apprehensions of approaching death, which we tried in vain to dispel. He was so low in the morning as to be scarcely able to speak. I remained in bed by his side to cheer him as much as possible. The doctor and Hepburn went to cut wood. They had hardly begun their labor when they were amazed at hearing the report of a musket. They could scarcely believe that there was really anyone near until they heard a shout, and immediately espied 3 Indians close to the house. Adam and I heard the latter noise, and I was fearful that a part of the house had fallen upon one of my companions, a disaster which had, in fact, been thought not unlikely. My alarm was only momentary. Dr. Richardson came in to communicate the joyful intelligence that relief had arrived. He and myself immediately addressed thanksgiving to the throne of mercy for this deliverance, but poor Adam was in so low a state that he could scarcely comprehend the information. When the Indians entered, he attempted to rise, but sank down again. But for the seasonable interposition of Providence, his existence must have terminated in a few hours, and that of the rest probably in not many days. But in the preceding trials and privations of that expedition there was one man, Michael, an Iroquois hunter, who did conceive the horrible idea of subsisting on the bodies of the stragglers, if not of even murdering the weakest with the express design of eating them, which is pretty certain. This man planned and executed his wolfish devices at a time when Sir John Richardson and Hepburn were afoot with him every day, when, though their sufferings were very great, they had not fallen into the weakened state of mind we have just read of, and when the mere difference between his bodily robustness and the emaciation of the rest of the party, to say nothing of his mysterious absences and returns, might have engendered suspicion. Yet so far off was the unnatural thought of cannibalism from their minds and from that of Mr. Hood, another officer who accompanied them, though they were all then suffering the pangs of hunger and were sinking every hour, that no suspicion of the truth dawned upon one of them until the same hunter shot Mr. Hood dead as he sat by a fire. It was after the commission of that crime, when he had become an object of horror and distrust, and seemed to be going savagely mad, that circumstances began to piece themselves together in the minds of the 2 survivors, suggesting a guilt so monstrously unlikely to both of them that it had never flashed upon the thoughts of either until they knew the wretch to be a murderer. To be rid of his presence, and freed from the danger that they at length perceived it to be fraught with, Sir John Richardson, nobly assuming the responsibility he would not allow a man of commoner station to bear, shot this devil through the head, to the infinite joy of all the generations of readers who will honor him in his admirable narrative of that transaction. The words in which Sir John Richardson mentions this Michael, after the earth is rid of him, are extremely important to our purpose, as almost describing the broad general grounds toward which we now approach. His principles, unsupported by a belief in the divine truths of Christianity, were unable to withstand the pressure of severe distress. His countrymen, the Iroquois, are generally Christians, but he was totally uninstructed and ignorant of the duties inculcated by Christianity, and from his long residence in the Indian country seems to have imbibed or retained the rules of conduct which the southern Indians prescribe to themselves. Heaven forbid that we, sheltered and fed, and considering this question at our own warm hearth, should audaciously set limits to any extremity of desperate distress. It is in reverence for the brave and enterprising, in admiration of the great spirits who can endure even unto the end, in love for their names and in tenderness for their memory, that we think of the specks, once ardent men, scattered about in different directions, on the waste of ice and snow, and plead for their lightest ashes. Our last claim in their behalf and honor against the vague babble of savages is that the instances in which this last resource, so easily received, has been permitted to interpose between life and death are few and exceptional, whereas the instances in which the sufferings of hunger have been borne until the pain was past are very many. Also, and as the citadel of the position, that the better educated the man, the better disciplined the habits, the more reflective and religious the tone of thought, the more gigantically improbable the last resource becomes. Beseeching the reader always to bear in mind that the lost Arctic voyagers were carefully selected for the service, and that each was in his condition no doubt far above the average, we will test the Eskimo kettle stories by some of the most trying and famous cases of hunger and exposure on record. This, however, we must reserve for another and concluding chapter next week. The Lost Arctic Voyagers, Part 1, from Household Words. Recording by Joyce Martin.